of the great things about Edmonton is that every so often you stumble upon something that helps to tell the history of the city. I remember I was already an adult and had spent a great deal of time walking around this part of downtown when I was young. But one day in the 1990s, I came along and discovered this Cornerstone, which was from First Presbyterian Church. Now, the building we're standing beside is First Presbyterian Church, which was built in 1912. But it was actually the third church built by this congregation, whose participation in the Edmonton community goes back to the 1880s. This church has always had, this congregation, a keen sense of its place in the history of Edmonton, in the community of Edmonton, and their own journey as a faith community. And so it's interesting when you discover something like this, dedicated to the 1902 church, the dedication stone from 1901 of this congregation, because the changes in their physical presence in the community reflects how Edmonton was growing. So the community dates itself back to 1881 when the first Presbyterian services were held inside McDougall Church, and that church, of course, is preserved at Fort Edmonton Park. Later, the congregation was meeting in a room above a grain warehouse where the convention center is now. And then finally, in 1882, the congregation built its own first church, which would have been at 4th Street and Mackay Avenue, 99th Avenue. They were in that church from 1882 to 1902, so 20 years. And in that time, Edmonton grew from a small community of a few hundred to a town of a few thousand, and would soon incorporate itself as a city with about 8,000 people. So by that end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, the congregation determined that the original wooden church was too small, so they built a larger church at the corner of 3rd Street and Jasper Avenue, and this Cornerstone is from that church. The very interesting thing is that church seated 500. And in 1902, Edmonton, as I say, was a city of a few thousand. By 1912, when this church opened, the city had grown fantastically. And that 500-seat church on Jasper Avenue was replaced with this one, which seats 1,250. And so that gives you, in that short decade, the amazing growth of Edmonton in the early part of the 20th century before the Great War. And to stumble upon this Cornerstone one day on a beautiful sunny day like today, it enabled me to use that as a springboard to discover some more about the history of this church. The wonderful thing about this congregation is they've taken their own journey very seriously and have spent a great deal of time talking about and displaying to Edmonton their participation in this community. The bell tower to my right is a very important feature of the church, and it includes in that a set of tubular bells, which actually were a gift from Johnny McDougall near the beginning of the opening of the church. Those bells have been in that tower for a very long time, but in the 1970s, the church spent a great deal of time restoring them so that they could ring again over Edmonton. Now, like all congregations, the ability to use certain gifts and treasures of the church depend on who's in the congregation at any particular time. But it's very heartening to realize that First Presbyterian Church congregation takes their role as custodians of this place of worship very seriously and have dedicated themselves to preserving it, to enriching it, and to ensure that its presence enriches the Edmonton community. So the smaller Cornerstone from the 1902 church reflects, of course, the fact that Edmonton had still to grow to its maturity. But one of the wonderful things about the Cornerstone for the 1912 church is that the stone itself is fashioned using pieces of that 1902 church. So these pillars in the Cornerstone behind us are actually from the 1902 church on Jasper Avenue at 3rd Street. And as you'll see, the stone itself records the history of the congregation from its beginnings in 1881 through to the current day. And the current pastor, his name is engraved on the stone. So this is why First Presbyterian is so special as a custodian of its own history and its pride in displaying that history to the people of Edmonton.